Welcome to the Wicked Podcast, where we read the business books you don't have the time for. I'm Marcus Kirsch.
And I'm Troy Norcross.
And we are your co-hosts for the Wicked Podcast.
So I've known you for years, Marcus. I've known you for years, and only 2 episodes ago did you drop in the fact that you used to be a gymnast. Not only are you a skateboarder, but you used to be a gymnast. How is it that I didn't know that?
Well, I was also a ballroom dancer. Did you know
Also
that?
a ballroom dancer?
While I was skateboarding, which was weird, walking with leather trousers and a skateboard under my arm into a ballroom dancing school.
Right.
Uncomplicated.
Yes, and incredibly talented. But speaking of incredibly talented people, do we have an incredibly talented guest on the show?
Yes, we do. We have Jon Key on our show and his book, Late Night Lessons from the COVID-19 Crisis, which reads like letters from the front line during World War II or something like that. It's pretty. It's a little book, but it's an amazing insight into him talking to CEOs during the COVID crisis, being a fly on the wall when things went bad, very, very bad. And he's got some amazing stories there for us. Where are your insights on this one?
So I did ask him the question about why about late nights, and so we're going to let you talk about that in a minute. What was my big takeaway? My big takeaway was: are we going to go back to business as usual when COVID has been quote unquote resolved? And the way I wrapped the question was around what happens when the risk of doing nothing goes away. Because with COVID around, you had to do something. The risk of doing nothing was enormous, and it was so huge that all of the other tiny little trivial risks got pushed out of the way, and people suddenly moved forward, whether it was working from
Isn't
home,
it
whether
crazy?
it's really
Absolutely.
crazy.
Yeah, we've been working in this thing for 20 years and we've been pushing people and asking and begging and ripping our left and right arms off, and no one moved. And suddenly, a couple of 100,000 people die and suddenly everyone moves. That's weird,
Yes,
right?
really weird. But what's going to happen? Are we going to go back to the same conservative, tried and stayed approach? I don't know. So we need to listen to that to find out what Jon has to say about that. But that was my big takeaway. What was your big takeaway?
So I got two things, or maybe I just got one thing. I don't know. But one of the things I found interesting, and it sounds a bit scary, but it's this late night meetings he had like past 9 p.m. And he said there's always at least a beer involved or something, and people literally really spilled the beans because A, they needed a drink. It was at the end of days, at the end of the day, and people were really honest about things. And then you really got to the crux of what's actually going on, how bad is it, what can we possibly do, and I think people started to way beyond politics and anything else go like how can we crack this? We need to do this. And those were really great insights and those were really great stories about that happening. And so one side of me thinks like, how can we recreate that? These late night meetings where everyone just stops being bothered and distracted by those small things that normally come to pass, where everyone talks about it for hours and hours, nothing actually gets discussed. Now, how can we recreate 9 p.m. meetings and get that same spirit in the room, authentic, open, like what's going on here? Interesting enough, nearly towards the end of the interview, so everyone should listen to it all the way to the end of the interview, he's actually talking about that in terms of planning as well. He said the kind of planning he saw, because I was saying there wasn't a lot of planning there. You couldn't plan, you just had to act and react, right? And he said, no, actually, there was much more planning, but it was more authentic planning. It was planning you could action straight away. It was not like, kumbaya, something, next year maybe. It was like, no, next week, tomorrow, we're gonna do this and this and that and that. And we plan it in the next 2 hours and then we're gonna execute it. I mean, and we know when we talk to organizations about be lean, be quick, whatever, that this is the way you should be doing things. And a lot of organizations only just found out that they can do these things. And that for me is a great insight, meaning that every organization actually can. They can. And I hope they remember that in the months to come. So
And
that's my big insight.
you're absolutely right. And what you're talking about, teams and the insights that you've had over the years and that I've had over the years, and how teams can operate. I wonder if there's an idea for a workshop in there in the future. But enough of my canny kind of dropping hints. What should we do now, Marcus?
Well, I'll not use the word yet, but we're gonna have our 50th episode coming up, and then we're gonna have a bit of a reveal, I think. Anyway, so for now, we're just gonna go to the interview. Hello, everyone. Today we're here with Jon Key. Hello, Jon. Thank you for being with us.
Hey guys,
hello.
Thanks for having me on.
So, as usual, we start at the top. So, please, Jon, tell our listeners who you are and why you wrote the book.
So I'm Jon. I've worked in business, I guess, all my life. I started my career in consulting, and then I've had a number of jobs in executive roles in various companies. And during the last 20 years or so, I've worked on supporting companies in developing their strategy, improving their businesses, transforming companies. And I've done that across a very wide range of companies, but mainly focused on engineering, industrials, energy. And last year, I worked with a number of clients across quite a few of those sectors, really for the last 18 months, all the way through the COVID-19 crisis. And I guess I was quite lucky or privileged to be a fly on the wall in a number of different leadership teams, management teams, observing and watching and working with chief executives and their teams as they navigated through the COVID-19 crisis, and still am, in fact. And I've always believed in learning lessons from your experiences or one's experiences, and also sharing those lessons when other people can benefit from them. And so at the end of the year, I decided I would try and document some of the things that I'd seen through the year. And it was partly, I guess, a cathartic experience for myself, wanting to almost take stock of what the hell just happened there through 2020, and partly to try and draw some lessons from it. So I kind of I revisited actually a number of my blogs that I'd written through the year and used those as a starting point, never having written a book before, and pulled it all together and then thought, well, this is an opportunity to turn it into a bit of a record of what happened from my perspective, and something I can look back on in the future when this crazy period becomes, a distant memory.
So one of the things that you referenced throughout the book that I found really interesting was late night video calls. So can you tell us a bit more about A, video calls, and B, why were so many of them late night?
It's a great question. So it was a busy period last year. So I think back to between March and September through 2020, there was a lot going on. We had at times half a dozen clients, and we were working on pretty intense projects, all remotely, all with teams who were very stretched and had a number of crises to deal with, or mini crises to deal with, that were born out of COVID-19. And really, at the end of those long days, it was really the only time that we could all get together and take stock. So I used to schedule these calls for 9 o'clock on a Thursday night. There'd always be a beer because most people on the call really needed one at that point after long days helping clients. And we had a number of people actually who were international. I'm not from the UK, so we had people joining from Australia, the US. We had a guy joining from Brazil at one point, and so it was a time frame that sort of worked from a practical perspective, but it was also very conducive to the discussion, and it generated. People weren't rushed into the next meeting. They weren't. It wasn't sandwiched in between one, management update and another leadership call. It It was more relaxed, I guess, or as relaxed as we could be during 2020, and it also drove up attendance. We had the number of people on the call varied from one call to the next. I think we started them as weekly calls actually, but a week was a very long time in COVID-19 back in March, April. A lot happened during any given week back then. Not I think it was probably true of everyone, not just us, and not just on the work front either. We had personal challenges, work challenges. So, and certainly in the UK, we found that COVID's policy and government policy, the data was shifting and moving on a weekly basis, on a daily basis back then. So from one week to the next, a lot changed, and it was a real for us, and I'm sure for many people, a real roller coaster, emotional roller coaster. Particularly with the personal thing going on in the background. Everyone has a personal story of 2020 and COVID, and either new people or knew of people was either directly or indirectly affected by the crisis as well. So the late night piece was quite important actually, because people really opened up about not just the practicalities of the project that they were working on or their observations on the business, but there was also very often a personal angle to some of the stories that people came up with as we went through the year.
And that's really great to get those level of insights that are, it's a terrible word to use because it's been so abused, but that are really authentic. It's like all the business is done, and now we're down to the authentic sort of answers. So I think it's really, really a privilege, when I get those kind of accesses, and for you to have, 6 months, maybe a year of those kind of authentic calls with a wide range of executives across a wide range of industries and jurisdictions and countries. Really, really great. Um, you packaged the book, as you said, based on your blogs. You pulled together, 12, maybe it's 15, I don't remember off the top of my head, individual kind of categories and sections. So we've got a few questions about, individual pieces and kind of drilling into some of the insights that you had. And one of them was so much about teams wanting to work for companies who had values that aligned with their own. And values have become very, very important to a lot of people. They've also become very polarizing. And how, as a company, do you kind of decide, do you pick a quote unquote tribe and align with their values and try to hire people and find customers that align with them? Or do you try to find middle ground and try to do a broader and more diverse approach? And that's the question.
Yeah, a lot of us had worked on projects for companies, looking at their values, defining their values, framing their values, coming up with a set of values for CEOs and their leadership teams, either from through discussions and interactions with the front line and with people across the organisation, in order to get to a set of values for the CEO and for the business. We'd all worked on projects like that one through our careers, and I think what happened during last year is a lot of those values really came to life. So we saw, I would say, all of our clients really focusing through last year, for example, on safety, but in a way in which they really hadn't done before, and in a way that really transcended everyone in the organisation, because the challenges of COVID and the threats of the pandemic, either from a direct perspective or indirectly through mental health challenges, through the kind of day-to-day challenge of keeping the workforce safe across companies from financial services businesses, global mining companies, energy companies, really came to life during the course of last year. And there were some other ones as well that had been developed in pre-COVID times. And most companies have got these values that, on the wall or on the website or wherever, that really came to life. So collaboration with one's colleagues and teammates, or collaboration across silos, across organisations, was another of those values that a lot of companies had before COVID-19. What we saw last year were around collaboration, were businesses really flattening their team structure, beginning to work across functions or geographies in a way that they had never done before. So we had a couple of particular examples where, in financial services, where we've been trying to push them actually, or help them develop a collaborative culture, and to unify the team and work together around a number of initiatives in the lead up to COVID. What we saw in COVID was suddenly you had a team of people who were really working together across IT, finance, HR, operations. Like many companies, they had a weekly crisis team that met at executive level to negotiate and navigate their way through COVID-19. And you had situations in that business and others where all of a sudden, the IT department went from being a frustration to being absolutely fundamental to helping the team navigate the crisis. And that was always the classic, actually. For some reason, IT came up a lot, but they were everyone was a hero in some way at some point in the crisis. With the IT guys, it was, help us find a way of working from home.
Sorry to maybe interrupt here a little bit, but that's I find that so compelling and fascinating, because this is the thing where, Troy and me, and maybe you have seen this in businesses for a long time. I look back at, post 2000, early 2000s, .com boom, digital is happening. and everyone's like, everything's changing now. Everyone's going to be doing digital, whatnot. And before you know it, not much happens. .com's crashing. Hardly anyone even bothers afterwards to run a decent website. IT is getting borderline shelved, or it's sort of a thing. It's just gets all messed up again, and people doubt the business value of going digital quite a bit, which then got us into this pickle when COVID hit. And in between, for good 15, 18 years, at least, in my job, I've been trying to convince organizations to go, no, it's easier, it's more flexible. Why don't you do that? People are going to be happier. It's more, you're going to be able to do amazing different things and be more flexible. So my question here is, if we say it took that kind of crisis for organizations to go, oh my God, we actually have to really forget all the usual petty politics and silos and actually come together. And hello, it's actually doable. So what took you so long? Why did it not happen? What makes the crisis? What are, in your observations, then sort of the characteristics where the dam broke and people were like, you know what? We have to. You know what? It's doable. You know what? Yes, we're just going to sit down, talk, and crack this and make it happen. And what are some of the characteristics or moments where you saw things being different? And did you figure out why suddenly? I mean, there's crises and there's crises, and organizations have been ineffective, inefficient a lot of times, and things went down and millions invested, not bringing any benefit back. We've all been there over the last 2 decades. What was the difference now? What do you think is sort of made the difference, and how? Can you
I think,
give us some examples there, maybe?
yeah, I think it was the necessity that management teams suddenly had to adapt or change or respond to the crisis. And it's a cliche, but necessity is the mother of invention. And um, and there are so many examples of businesses that before COVID would say, it took 2.5 years to launch a product, or it took 18 months to get a product or service online, or it took 6 months to migrate everyone to home working. Or it took 10 years to develop a vaccine, or it took 18 months to design a ventilator, design and build a ventilator. And I think what we all saw during the crisis is all of those timeframes just went out of the window. And goodness knows what those marketing and product managers will be saying now, because we all know that it takes a fraction of the time to get shit done when there's a crisis like the one we've just had. And for me, it's fascinating because another example is we were pushing a number of clients to reduce their travel budget, and the numbers we were talking about before COVID were 20-30% reduction in travel budget. You might want to consider video conferencing. There's this new thing called Teams and Zoom, and obviously we all know what happened. Travel budgets were slashed by 95% or higher, and actually the businesses didn't fall over. So one business in particular, a global ship management business. So these guys, they're managing 700 ships across the world, and prior to COVID, that whole industry was really one of face-to-face meetings and a culture of traveling around the world, sometimes twice in a fortnight, and overnight, executives in those businesses were unable to travel. That the IT department again stepped up to the plate. Teams was available. I wonder what would have happened if COVID had hit 10 years ago or 15 years ago, before we had Zoom and Teams and these alternative ways of communicating. Um, but we've had them for at least 5 years, and none of us used them, obviously, until COVID hit. So I think one of the things COVID has, I guess, taught all of us is that there are benefits that come out of the crisis, benefits that come out of necessity, and so businesses will be thinking about how to create their own crises. They'll be thinking about how to motivate, how to attain those levels of motivation, teamwork, collaboration, innovation in in peacetime. And that's, I guess, one of those lessons that I talked about before that I wanted to capture in the book, because I think when people return maybe to um, a, a kind of way of operating where they go back to the old ways. Um, they're less agile, they move less quickly. I think it's important to remember what can be achieved when an organisation puts its mind to it, and I think the benchmark um, will be COVID. It's been a hugely challenging year for all all businesses, but most of the businesses that we've worked with have said they've observed behaviours and ways of working and efficiencies, and effective teams um, during the crisis that actually they hadn't thought were possible, um, and so I think many leaders will be looking at that and trying to recreate it once this is over.
So I've got lots and lots of great thoughts that were coming up as you were talking, but I didn't want to kind of interrupt your flow. Um, Necessity is not just the mother of invention; it's also the mother of all screw ups. It's another kind of saying that not all necessity responses are good. Milton Friedman was the one that says only in a crisis, real or imagined, is when real change occurs, and it's the opportunities that are in a drawer or lying around that usually get pulled out and put into force during that time. And I think there were indeed a number of plans and systems that were indeed ready, that were indeed in place, that were waiting for somebody to give them a green light and waiting for somebody to say yes. And this is a long preamble to the fact that the majority of problems I see in business are risk aversion related. And when COVID happens, the risk of doing nothing was substantially greater than the risk of trying something new. And my question to you is, do you think if you remove the risk of doing nothing, will they still maintain their agile approach? Will they still move fast? Will they still suddenly realize the barriers that were there are not real?
It's a great question. I think, and there's a for me there's a broader question, which is to what extent will um, behaviours uh, go back to how they were before the crisis, or how will the world, to what extent will the world go back to how it was before the crisis? I think as an optimist, uh, I would hope that as we remove the risk of doing nothing, um, or as we um, come back to normality, um, those muscles that businesses used during the crisis to respond to the crisis, to be agile, to um, to experiment, to innovate, to try things they wouldn't have tried before, perhaps. Those muscles that they've learned how to use during COVID, they'll be able to use um, after the crisis. Um, and actually, one uh, existential crisis, which dwarfs COVID, and the coronavirus, is the environmental crisis that we all face. I think it's a really, really interesting comparison between COVID and the existential environmental crisis that we all face. My sense is that it's no coincidence that there's been this shift in the last year to 18 months towards the green agenda. It's become a lot more mainstream than it ever was. Momentum is building around mankind's need to solve the problem of climate change. And I do think if there's a silver lining in the timing of the terrible crisis that's COVID-19, I actually think it could be a rechanneling or a repurposing of that muscle, of those abilities to do things quickly, or to respond, or to trial, to test, to innovate, for mankind to use that muscle to solve the other existential crisis. I hope I'm right. There's a
Absolutely.
risk, obviously, that in 6 months' time.
I really hope. Yeah, I hope you're right too, John. As usual, we have more questions than time. It's always the case. We'd love to talk to you for hours. So here's sort of our last question then for the day, which is so one of the things, therefore, when people have to rally up and just do things quickly and be flexible and likely, you can't really plan things. So one of the things is like plans are useless, planning is indispensable. At the same time, how do you see is relating strategy and tactics of corporate goals. We've just been through a phase where probably we couldn't plan a lot. We had to act. And actually that probably saved a lot of organizations. So some of them now have the experience of knowing that actually all this planning, all this stuff might be absolutely a waste of time. Maybe it is, maybe it isn't. What's your current angle on exactly that, to say, look, we just went through a phase to show that we can be more flexible than ever, but not really planning, because every strategy tends to, get eaten by reality. But at the same time, it's good to have a planning long-term goal. Sustainability and all these things are long-term goals. We have to play the long game, right, in order to do the real things of value for all of us. So what's your experience? What's your view on that aspect, on that double-sided coin?
Yeah, so I think planning. We've actually seen a lot more planning during COVID than we might think, because even when you're acting very quickly or reacting very quickly, some of the things that have been achieved by businesses are complex, and they require a degree of coordination and a degree of, albeit short-term planning, in order to enable the home office move, to enable the new products innovation, to enable new processes, new systems. I actually think there's probably more planning than we might think, but the planning that's been done in the last year has been highly actionable. The plan has been used in order to drive change. The plans have been followed and shared in order to communicate across teams. Maybe what we haven't seen are long-term strategic plans, because a lot of businesses have been in survival mode. But to achieve what most businesses have achieved, whether it's to move into lockdown, if it's to close a global chain of cinemas, for example, a huge amount of planning is required and coordination to do that. Even if it's a small business, to go into lockdown or to come out of lockdown requires a level of coordination and planning that businesses haven't generally had to do in the past. I think there's a separate question about long-term planning and longer-term strategy and thinking about where the business is going, not in the next week or month, but in the next 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, and really thinking ahead to a more strategic time frame. And I think what we're seeing in the businesses that we're working with is that's now where leaders are turning their attention. And what they're finding is they can't use a traditional mechanical turn the handle annual strategy process in order to think about that, those time horizons. They actually need something quite different, which is much purer and creative strategy. And actually what we're finding is those types of strategy projects don't happen or haven't happened much in the lead up to COVID. But now every business needs to think about what the post-COVID-19 world will look like, how their markets are going to change, how the competitive landscape is going to change, how they need to invest for the medium and long term. So I think what we're going to see is those short-term plans that businesses had during COVID and the level of coordination and the way in which they pulled together in order to survive and navigate the crisis. I think those same muscles and the same attention to planning will now be turned to much longer-term timeframes. And we're certainly seeing the kind of projects that we're working on now are really close to pure strategy. What will those businesses need to look like over the next 10 years? I still think the statement that plans are
really
planning is essential, but plans are useless holds, because clearly none of us can predict what the world will look like in 10 years' time. But that doesn't mean it isn't important for businesses to think about their long-term plans.
Yeah. Absolutely. I mean, I come from a design background, so us thinking about what could you do, what could be possible is always part of that. It's a natural part of it. What can you achieve is a different question and a different answer. But, it's always good to look at, well, what could we? Well, let's see where we can go, let's see how far we could do. It's brilliant. So unfortunately, this is our time. And these are really great insights, and I think it's really interesting to look at this as a, like the last answer in sort of a more authentic or more real kind of strategy or planning. That by itself is a really great idea, a great insight on that. So beyond that, Jon, thank you so much for your time and your insights and for being with us today. Thank you so much.
Thank you, guys.
You've been listening to The Wicked Podcast with co-host Marcus Kirsch and me, Troy Norcross.
Please subscribe on Podomatic, iTunes, or Spotify. You can find all relevant links in the show notes. Please tell us your thoughts in the comment section and let us know about any books for future episodes.
You can also get in touch with us directly on Twitter on @WickedandBeyond or @Troy_Norcross. Also, learn more about the Wicked Company book and the Wicked Company project at wickedcompany.com.